For many, the 1980s was a time for everything heavy metal. Motley Crue, Slayer, Metallica, Megadeth, and of course, the new wave of British heavy metal with Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, and Def Leppard. Ride the Lightning, Shout at the Devil, Rain in Blood, Peace Sells But Who's Buying? These records were but a mere snapshot of the musical dominance of the era. However, in 1985 in New York City, there was a completely different sound developing. It was an experimental sound that turned into somewhat of an underground movement called noise rock or noise punk. It took inspiration from experimental rock, industrial music, electronic, and even hardcore styles. Sonic Youth, Big Black, and Swans were some of the leading figures within this scene. One band, however, would take this in an entirely unique direction, not only focusing on experimental rock music, but also developing an image inspired by horror films. This band were even named after a 1930s horror film, and that name was White Zombie. And 2 albums specifically would turn them into what you could call a cult classic in terms of musical artistry. Sexorcisto, Devil Music Volume 1, and Astro-Creep 2000 would be the albums that caught everyone's attention. The entire concept for this horror-inspired experimental musical outfit was the vision of one man, a man with a passion for all things spooky. This is More Human Than Human, the story of Rob Zombie. Rob Zombie was born Robert Bartleh Cummings, January 12, 1965 in Haverhill, Massachusetts, and he had a younger brother, Michael David Cummings, born in 1968. Michael would grow up to be Spider One, the lead singer of alternative metal band Powerman 5000. According to their mother, Louise Cummings, they were pretty quiet kids indoors and would spend most of their time in the bedroom reading science fiction books or glaring at the TV. Louise would also drive them to Star Trek conventions in Philadelphia and New York, as Rob and his brother were big Trekkies. Zombie says his hometown was boring at best, so he had to find other ways to entertain himself, and school itself would form part of that boredom. We've got nothing better to do, let's go break something. You walk down the streets at night and no one's around. You could do anything you wanted and no one would notice. I was like Mr. Invisible Guy who hated high school. I was counting the seconds until I could leave. The problem with high school is there's one mold they jam everybody into. I wish I quit sooner. Why did I stay until the end? What did I get out of it? Headaches. After Rob graduated high school, he left his quiet little hometown in 1983 and headed to New York. He picked up some odd jobs that included working as a bike messenger, an art director for some adult magazines, and even a production assistant on Pee-wee's Playhouse around 1986.
A lot of shorts here.
Yes, there are a lot of shorts.
It was a cool job to have, but I was probably 19 years old. It was everything from delivering stuff to doing little crap work around the set. I don't even know if I was a PA, whatever is just below a PA. I'm not even sure it counts as below a PA, but that was my job. Lowest rung on the ladder. That would be the title I'd give myself for that job. A year prior to this, in 1985, when attending Parsons School of Design in New York, Rob would bring the concept of his first band and stage name to life. It seemed that Rob spent his childhood trying to figure out exactly what he wanted to do with his life. Several things seemed to stand out: films, comics, movies, etc. The first vinyl single, or 45 as they were known as, Rob purchased, roughly when he was around 10 years old, was the Jackson 5 Dancing Machine, released in 1974. I didn't aspire to be anything. I was just some dopey kid. I loved comic books, I loved movies, I loved music, and I couldn't distinguish really what I wanted to do. Although I didn't think I could do any of them. But as a kid, you know you'd read Marvel comics, and Stan Lee seemed like as much of a superstar as Alice Cooper. Basically, everyone seemed amazing to me as a kid when you grow up in some nowhere town. They seemed like they were on another planet. Whilst music caught him at an early age, Rob and some of his friends in high school also decided to film an amateur sequel to John Carpenter's 1981 science fiction film Escape from New York, starring Kurt Russell. So it seemed spending hours in front of a TV, watching every single movie he could, also rubbed off on him. His first band would be called White Zombie, a name taken from a film of the same name released in 1932. The film is also known as a pre-code film, an era of filmmaking that took place between 1927 to 1934, prior to the introduction of what is essentially now motion picture censorship guidelines.
A glass of wine, or perhaps a flower.
This fascination with horror is something that would influence many aspects of Rob's musical vision for years to come, and ultimately help to separate his work from many alternative artists of the time. Rob would actually co-found White Zombie with his then girlfriend Shauna Salt, born Shauna Reynolds, who would become the bass player.
It's been like, whatever, during that month and a half we kind of put all the riffs together and wrote some songs. But
White Zombie would undergo some lineup changes during the 80s, but would also start to release music. I was in ballet and piano classes by the age of 4, and was reading music before first grade. The first band I ever saw was Joan Jett and the Blackhearts. I was 16 and had a fake ID. That show changed my life. I was already a huge Ramones fan, and Joan seemed like a female Ramone. A student and friend of my parents gave me a big bag of cassettes when I graduated high school, and there was everything in there, from the Cramps to Vom. Gods on Voodoo Moon, released in 1985 as an independent EP limited to 300 copies, would be the first offering from White Zombie. In 1987, their debut album Soul Crusher would be released, followed by a second LP in 1988 called Make Them Die Slowly, neither of which garnered much attention. This was most likely down to the fact that White Zombie was still trying to find their sound and was still quite raw when it came to the experimental aspect of their music. Plus, you have the fact that this was the peak era for glam metal and thrash along with heavy metal. The alternative scene was dominated by Motley Crue, Def Leppard, Metallica, and Judas Priest. People just weren't really interested or even ready in underground experimental noise. The 1990s, however, would be the perfect decade for White Zombie to infect the world. The 1990s would see the birth of a brand new culture. It would be the evolution of the MTV generation. Although launched in 1981, it morphed into something truly alternative towards the end of the 80s, with Headbangers Ball.
I mean, because of Beavis and Butthead, and is it kind of weird that so many people watch?
With you, man.
Is it weird that so many people watch that? You know what? So many people, and the fact is, they're watching it and they don't realize that Beavis and Butthead is a comedy.
And Beavis and Butthead would become arguably the most popular cartoon cult characters of the decade. The first episode of Headbangers Ball aired on Saturday, April the 18th, 1987, and quickly became popular with the headbanging youth of America. The show helped bring the likes of Megadeth, Pantera, Anthrax, Korn, and White Zombie to millions of kids across the nation. This one show contributed to the success of heavy metal in the 80s and 90s more so than any radio station ever could. Of all the places Rob Zombie could have ended up, this was probably the least predictable, considering he says he was shy as a kid and often suffered from social anxiety, to the point where he didn't even like answering the telephone. Zombie would feature on an episode of Headbangers Ball with Phil Anselmo of Pantera in 1992, coinciding with their second New Era album Vulgar Display of Power. In the same year, White Zombie would release what some consider to be their breakthrough album, Sexorcisto, Devil Music Volume 1. Rob, however, didn't think the band would ever go anywhere. You can be an idiot and make it. I remember when I got kicked out of school, I was probably 19, maybe 20. I was just sitting there thinking, well, I did it. I'm a fucking loser. I was making $100 a week. White Zombie was a band it seemed that everyone hated, and no matter what, we had to be literally the last band in New York City to get a record deal. Maybe that's why we got it. We're out of bands, so we'll have to sign them. Sexorcisto not only broke into the Billboard charts, landing them a top 30 album spot, but it also saw a drastic change in musical direction.
The wheels of his Mustang exploding on the highway like
There are probably a few main things we can attribute this to. First of all, White Zombie were now signed to a major label, Geffen Records, all because Rob wouldn't accept a record deal from anyone else.
They were barely demos. We were like, what the hell, let's make a record out of it.
This is the same label that released Appetite for Destruction in 1987, Nirvana's Nevermind, and Seasons in the Abyss by Slayer, released in 1990, which meant White Zombie now had access to world-class producers. Andy Wallace would be the producer in question for Sexorcisto. And of course, the horror and science fiction themes would run wild as always. When I was a little kid, there was just so much horror on television. It was the late 60s, so there was sort of a horror boom. Magazines like Creepy, Eerie, Vampirella, and then on TV it was The Munsters, The Addams Family, The Twilight Zone, The Outer Limits. Even sitcoms, Bewitched and I Dream of Jeannie, everything had some sort of musical tie-in. I think that's what got me hooked on music. Having already worked with Slayer, Nirvana, Sepultura, and even Run DMC, Andy Wallace was more than qualified to take White Zombie to the next level. On top of this, the music videos for Thunderkiss 65 and Black Sunshine received heavy rotation on MTV, and White Zombie also featured in an episode of Beavis and Butthead, where the cartoon headbangers rock out to Welcome to Planet Motherfucker. The album featured a host of audio samples, one taken from the 1978 zombie horror film Dawn of the Dead, another taken from an episode of Batman that aired in 1966, and on the second to last track, Starface, the song samples a clip from Star Trek, the original series, the show that both Rob and his brother were obsessed with as children. One last thing would be key to the success of this album, and that was the introduction of a new band member, Jay Yuenger. Jay joined White Zombie in 1990, replacing John Ricci, who had to leave the band due to ongoing issues with carpal tunnel syndrome, affecting his ability to play. Although at the time, Jay thought this might not be the right fit for him. When I joined the band, they were making a conscious decision that they wanted to be more of a metal group, and that they wanted to be within the metal scene. This was a conscious decision. And when I met them, I was really into metal, so that was great for me. I mean, when I listened to the Soul Crusher record, that guitar playing is crazy. I couldn't do that. And when they called me, when I initially talked to Rob and Sean, that's what I knew from them. So I just thought, I can't play that, that's insane. It's like backwards guitar. I can't do that. These are all incredibly intricate events that happened at the right time and at the right place for White Zombie, and if any of these variables were even slightly off, then White Zombie may well have fallen by the wayside before anyone even really knew who they were. And then of course, the world would have never been graced with the masterpiece that was Astro-Creep 2000. The mid-90s, grunge was dying and nu metal was rising. Heavy metal, hard rock, and industrial metal were taking over. Marilyn Manson, Korn, Fear Factory, and Ministry were just some of the artists that were about to shape an entirely new era of alternative music over the coming decade. In 1995, White Zombie released Astro-Creep 2000, and despite it becoming the band's most commercially successful record, this was the beginning of the end for the horror-inspired, experimental super beast of a group. Rob Zombie and Shaun Assault, who formed the band whilst being in a relationship, were no longer an item, which is not an ideal position to be in if your career is working in a band together and sharing each other's space 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on tour. Everything about it should have been great. We had finally made it. We sold millions of records, we were playing in big sold-out arenas. On the outside, it looked great, but on the inside, it sucked. Drummer Ivan DePrume, who had been with the band for several years, was replaced by John Tempesta, who had done a brief stint with American thrash metal icons Testament. And there'll be a documentary coming on Testament soon, so hit subscribe if you don't want to miss that one. Tempesta was also the drummer for Exodus during the early 90s, featuring on Impact is Imminent and Force of Habit, released in 1992. Astro-Creep 2000 would land White Zombie a number 6 spot on the Billboard chart and spend 27 weeks in the top 50. The record itself was produced by the legendary Terry Date, who had worked on albums for Metal Church, Soundgarden, Pantera, and Overkill. But at some point during the success of Astro-Creep 2000, or maybe even before, Rob Zombie decided he wanted to work on his first solo record. And it seemed as if he may have already decided that White Zombie was no longer worth pursuing. First of all, I knew that we were breaking up. It wasn't a big surprise, but it was a little bit of a slap in the face to me and Jay. After 1 year, we were supposed to be taking a break, and then we were going to have a call and talk about getting back together and making a record. I knew that we weren't getting back together, but literally the next day, Jay and I both said, "We have more riffs, we'd love to write some more music." And Rob kept saying, "No, no, no, I think we're done." And what are you going to say? You can't tell the singer that he has to sing. Rob Zombie himself, though, simply said that he felt White Zombie had done everything they could creatively. However, half of his band was still writing music during their year out, so obviously not everyone felt that this was the case. Maybe there was something else going on behind the scenes, or maybe Rob simply felt that the band had grown apart, or like most groups, creative differences may have come into play. Either way, in 1998, White Zombie was officially dead, and on August the 25th of the same year, Rob Zombie released his first debut album, Hellbilly Deluxe, 13 Tales of Cadaverous Cavorting Inside the Spook Show International. The two biggest singles from this record would be Super Beast and Dragula.
Dying as you burn through the ditches and burn.
The record was released on Geffen Records, hit number 5 on the Billboard charts in the USA, and would go on to be certified 3 times platinum in the US. It also featured Tommy Lee of Motley Crue on the songs Meet the Creep and the ballad Resurrection Joe and Rosa Hoare. For some White Zombie fans, Astro-Creep 2000 would be the pinnacle of Rob Zombie's musical career, whereas others see his solo work as a continuation of the White Zombie concept. Maybe he wanted to pursue a similar path to Alice Cooper, as this was one of his idols growing up, and one of the original shock rockers of the day. Alice is everything to me. I like Ozzy, but Alice was the person I grew up loving. and he set the standard for live shows. So I think that I would give Alice everything over Ozzy on that front. Everything about him is the best. And in 1995, Rob even had the opportunity to record a song with Alice Cooper called Hands of Death, Burn Baby Burn, which would be released in 1996. A song that featured on an X-Files compilation album called Songs in the Key of X. This would have been recorded around the time of Astro-Creep 2000 blowing up. Maybe it gave Rob the idea of becoming more like an Alice Cooper character. Whatever the true reasons behind the demise of White Zombie, their contributions to experimental rock and metal music certainly were more human than human.